Molecules and mythologies. I guess the poem Ode to the Water Molecule is really about a state of fluidity more than anything else. Um, this is something that exists in time and in space. It's all about movement, about change, about things being absorbed into other things, about things being in constant relationship to one another, physical relationship, sort of psychological relationship, mythological relationship, all that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, very much. I think the notion of water and fluidity is something I do equate very much with the act of writing and making poetry. It is about a flow. It's about um, an indirect passage, if you like, too. It's about a meandering course often. But it's also about things slipping into other things, about things being absorbed into other things. Often it's about big things being absorbed into little things, big meanings being kind of somehow imparted through small details from the world. But I think it's very much a world in flux. And I guess that's one thing I do think is very fundamental to some of the writing I've been doing around the Pacific Ocean in books like Whale Years, talking about this whole notion of the fact that, as people in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we do live on an island in the middle of an ocean, and that ocean is a very defining thing. The same way if you live, in Jamaica, the Caribbean is a very defining thing. People in that region are defined by the waters that surround them, at least as much as they are by any landmass. So I do think in terms of my own identity, I guess, as a New Zealander, is also tied up with this notion of being an Oceanian, to use a term that Ipele Hauofa, the Fijian Tongan writer, used very much. We are people that get our sense of identity and purpose and nature from the fact that we do live in the middle of a fluid mass, which is the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, which takes up about half the space on the planet Earth. It's a huge, vast, defining mass of water. And I do think kind of in all sorts of ways, it's an empowering thing. It's a kind of a sense of, it's not so much ownership of concrete things, it's very much about being a part of a universe of movement and possibility and dynamism and change. But also, I guess, and this is the other thing about water, it is the source of life on the planet. So essentially, maybe I'm getting back to a kind of positivism or optimism here, but it's very much relating to a positive energy source, a life force, which is the ocean. It's the thing that replenishes the air of the planet, that keeps life on the planet going. And so in a kind of I suppose in a humble way, I'd sort of park poetry adjacent to that ocean and say that I think poetry is part of kind of our being alive in the world and keeping the world alive in us. Art and political memory. The poem Apparition of the Chilean Dictator's Head, a poem which kind of conflates, I guess, the kind of the shadowy past of Chile, as embodied really by Pinochet and his dictatorship, and also a sense of the past as experienced on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, where I was at the time I wrote the poem, when we were spending a lot of time walking around the moai, the large stone heads that punctuate the coastline and interior of that island. I was very much inspired, I guess, when I wrote this poem by the films of Patricio Guzman, who made 3 films called The Battle of Chile, around the time of and shortly after the coup in the early 1970s. Guzman also made an incredible film called Nostalgia for the Light very recently. I was so inspired by his work. I thought, what a magnificent life's work. There are other films as well, a film about Allende, some really kind of remarkable, beautiful films, but very, very political. I mean, they're about a situation that he found unavoidable. being in Chile, I suppose I felt very humbled by being in that place. I felt in awe, really, of the kind of, I suppose, the resistance people had put up to the dictatorship. It's a very haunted country. It's a country, where you feel the past is sort of won't let you get away from it. And certainly going to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, because that's part of Chile, of course, that also had a sense of, I guess, the kind of the legacy of those years. My poem, I don't know, I suppose I'm venting a little bit of anger. I mean, there is that problem, I guess, with political poetry. There's that you tend to want to start yelling and screaming, and really poetry is much closer, I guess, to whispering or sort of, making some kind of incantation or utterance, deeper utterance. So I guess that's a kind of a kind of tension that you get when you're trying to deal with that sort of territory. For me, I suppose I kind of, with the poem, I sort of made it, I suppose, a little bit sort of playful, a bit ironic, a bit strange. Nicanor Parra, there are plenty of Chilean writers, it seems to me, that sort of play that game very well, using almost a kind of comic writing to write about the dictator, and to sort of somehow undermine and get your own back, if you like, on history and on the miscarriages of justice and human decency that are very much a part of that. In terms of the whole idea of historical trauma, I mean, that's something I guess people all over the world kind of deal with. I do remember when I was in my early 20s, my family are all Irish, really, recently washed up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But I remember going to Dublin for the first time and going to the National Museum and being struck walking through the museum, just the incredible kind of unmitigated anger against the British that seemed to be manifest in just about every single display. They would have a bullet on display somewhere and say, this is the bullet that sort of went through the head of so-and-so and ended up in the wall. It was full of quite sort of, it was almost kind of like a religious reliquary. But I didn't actually feel in the end it was a good thing. It felt to me like a kind of an inability to take that history and move forward with it. It felt kind of a bit encumbered by it. And certainly throughout the Pacific, one sees the legacy of colonialism. It's, a lot of bad things went down, a lot of harm was done. That's part of the reality. But I guess as a writer, what one has to do is sort of find a way of acknowledging that, sort of holding that reality close and feeling it, and not for a moment denying it, but then also, I suppose, sort of moving forward with it. And in a way, I suppose one gets a certain power from it, the power of making peace with the past, of the situation that we live in today, personally and hopefully as a society, which is very much, more balanced and interactive and inspiring in different ways. I mean, that's why, certainly for me, I've done a lot of collaborative work with other artists and writers. And, for years I've been making etchings with John Poulet, an artist and writer from the island of Niue, up near the equator, almost directly north of New Zealand. Those conversations to me are just so important to what I do. In terms of my own work as well as the work I do with John, I know that everything I do really is filtered through a kind of sense of that shared reality that we have, which is a post-colonial reality. If you want to work out what actually I wouldn't describe it as anything quite as sort of buttoned down as that, though. I think we're post-colonial, but I'd like to think we transcend colonial. It's a dynamic thing, and it's not a categorical thing. It's a thing, a bit like I was saying before about being an Oceanian. It's something that we're swept up in, and we're going forward. And I think we're going forward, certainly as artists and writers and poets, with a kind of a purpose and a positive energy, but also a great shared mission and a love of the place that we're in, the people that we're with, and the work that we can create together. I recently went to Japan with Robin White, a New Zealand artist, and that was a great experience too, in terms of she does a lot of work using tapa cloth, things like that, using materials that are communally made. Tapa is paper bark that's made by groups of women in villages in Tonga, pounding bark cloth into a kind of paper, which is then used for painting and stuff. And So you realise the creative act it also involves nature, involves human beings, involves the young, it involves the old, it involves the Palangi white people as it does the native people, the indigenous people. But it also involves the trees, involves the earth, involves the water. Everything is involved in the process. So, I kind of think maybe that's like poetry too. It does involve all the elements, the social setting, as well as the inner life and the experience, and also the listening and the reading that we do all the time to kind of enrich our viewpoints. The minute and the cosmic. I guess is one of the great sort of paradoxes and juxtapositions that exist within creative work, whether you're a painter or whether you're a poet. I mean, the fact that in a poem a mosquito can be bigger than a train. By the way you write about it, it can be written up and other things can be written down. Things are changing all the time. And to me, that's one of the great joys, I think, of poetry is one, can change the scale. You can be looking at the Grand Canyon, but all you can see is a small beer can sitting next to your foot, or something like that. It's all about attentiveness and attention. I guess within our consciousness, we make and remake the world all the time, and that constantly involves a shift in focus and attention. It's a bit like a camera lens, I guess. One moves close up, sees something, it takes up the whole of the frame. If you're very close to a beer can, it will, obliterate the Grand Canyon. As you move away, it becomes part of a bigger scene. But that kind of shift of focus, to me, as someone who paints as well as writes poetry, to me that's something I'm very aware of. The way, the way the shapes of things, the weights of things, the proportions of things, the way the objects create negative spaces around them, which are part of a painting's content. And I do think very much it's the same in a poem, the way you place things, the space around them, the amount of room they take up. These are all things that I don't think we consciously go through, with a ruler and try and calibrate what we're doing. But there is a sense always, I think, that, the scale of things is shifting. I think the great thing about poetry, poetry is meant to surprise people. It's not meant to be a, retreading of the world we know already in terms that we know already. It's meant to be about pushing things into a new way of seeing and a new way of being, and to release new kind of energies from them. And I do think the whole that compositional element, bringing the small and the large together, possibly, in terms of that thing, the word cosmic, obviously that's a slightly problematic one, in as much as most of us aren't very good at sort of depicting, be it in paint or in words, the exact shape of the broader cosmos. But I guess what one can do is arrive at some kind of impression or response, or kind of removing some kind of thread from it that somehow offers a kind of a sense of it without depicting it or describing it. We don't want to describe things or depict them. We want to somehow just evoke or hint at or bring to a certain kind of poetic life. And I guess that's the paradox, is often in very small details. That's how it's done. The universe in the grain of sand, just that complete, I suppose, that wonderful kind of paradox. And poetry and literature is loves paradoxes. It loves inversions and surprises. In terms of the poem Afternoon of an Evening Flight, I guess to me that's a poem about being at the airport. Airports are usually full of very big aeroplanes. The poem sort of zeroes in just on the shadow of a person riding a bicycle with their arms outstretched, their hands off the handlebars and with their arms outstretched, and seeing the shadow on the tarmac of the person on the bike, and it looks like a cross or almost a crucifix, but actually like an aeroplane. So the poem, in a way, sort of the attention of the poem starts off with a picture of Wellington Airport and I suppose the grand, almost cosmic scale of air travel and that whole kind of apparatus, which is modern airport. And then it just sort of reduces down to a man on a bicycle and then to the man on the bicycle's shadow on the ground. And then the poem ends, and in a way the scene sort of dissolves. To me, that's a constant movement, I think, between the large view, the wide view, and the microscopic or close-up or, intimate view. Humour and surrealism. Yeah, no, they're two things I feel pretty comfortable with, I'd have to say, in terms of poetry. I do remember when I started writing, surrealism was used as quite a put down for work, by, I suppose, the more kind of fusty conservative elements in the New Zealand poetic scene. I suppose as a movement, it has its limits if you think of Salvador Dali and, Breton and Ernst and everyone. But I suppose just to me as a mode of operation, it's another part of that fluidity thing. I mean, surrealism is about the, mobility between dreams and reality, between sense and nonsense, between comprehension and incomprehension, and all sorts of other things. So it's a kind of word that I'm quite happy to use. Same with humour too. I mean, I do think, to have a brightness and a kind of levity in writing, obviously not all the time, and obviously it's something that can kind of come and go, to me is a marvellous kind of quality in poetry. And you get it in the great poets. You certainly get a lot of it in Shakespeare. But of course you also get it in Neruda, and you get it in James K. Baxter, and you get it in Bill Manhire. You get it in so much of the poetry that's worth reading. So I think humour and surrealism are not things to be avoided. They're things to be handled carefully. I mean, as indeed everything is to be handled carefully, like politics and poetry, like metaphysics and poetry. Everything's got to be handled in a way that that kind of questions it and doesn't presume too much. That sort of allows things to kind of to mean what they do, and also maybe for those meanings to slightly undo themselves and to morph into other meanings. The poem, one of the sections from 3 postcards from Valparaiso, to me probably gives a sense of that kind of levity that I like. Like many of my poems, it's filled up with kind of lots of kind of, I suppose, elements that are found. There's mention in the poem about Mr. Colorista on his paint-splattered ladder. Sounds of words are another thing. Mr. Colorista is beautiful. That was the name of a paint shop in Santiago de Chile, so I didn't invent that. But just those wonderful IS sounds. But also having a colourful man. It's almost like an image of a clown. It's a lovely thing. Later on, I mentioned Mr. Tribalista. Again, that's me playing around, but what I'm referring to there is the Brazilian pop band Tribalistas, who we totally love and strike me as being a great model for creative work in the modern world, and also for positive energy and joy and beauty and a lot of humour. So I recommend Tribalistas if anyone is interested in Brazilian music. So there's a bit of name dropping in there. In terms of, I suppose, the verbal fabric. I mean, I talk a lot about images, I guess, because I'm a painter and I also write about art. And so I guess in terms of the content of an artwork or the content of a poem, I often talk about that. But also, I do think, obviously the sound of words is a thing. Mr. Colorista has a bounce in it. Later in that poem, I have, his private funicular. It's, to me, it's an image, but it's also a kind of a piece of music. It's a piece of slightly screwball, possibly South American inflected kind of sound making. And perhaps to me that's one thing. That also lapses into surrealism a bit, a kind of a closeness, hopefully, to nursery rhymes, to children's songs, to folk songs, and also to kind of ecclesiastical songs. I've always been very interested in the Latin and the whole that Catholic tradition, just in a musical sense more than anything else to start with. And I do think with my own poems, that's something I like to do, is to have different kinds of words moving at different speeds. To me, something like that. This little poem here, the little triplet near the end mentions his private funicular and Mr. Tribalista's praiseworthy odes. It's quite slow, and then the final stanza sort of speeds up. Odes to the flaming tree, the back half of a dog, the goddess of cats. So almost monosyllabic, short, sharp, bang, 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 and then the poem sort of like jumps back into the hedge or jumps back under cover again. So playing with the kind of the seriousness of words, the lightness and the brevity and the rhythm of them. To me, that's very much part of it, and that's something to me that's kind of humorous too. If we're surprised, that often has humour in it. It has levity, and to me, there's a kind of a more serious thing that comes in there too. It's a kind of a sense of almost hope, a sense of belief that the world is here and it's on our side, and it surprises us. And despite everything that alarms us so much, it's a place that generates positive energy and possibility.